You know, we talk a lot about storytelling with data, and even when we're working with young kids and teaching them to work with data, we talk about storytelling. I think Lee Peek mentioned yesterday that sometimes that term makes her palms sweaty because there is an association that people often have when they talk about storytelling, that there's this element of fiction, that you're making something up. And I'm curious how in your own work you've navigated that language around creating a narrative that's driven by data and not wandering into that realm of creating something that is fictional or made up or, you know, whatever in this sort of post-truth world we live in.
One of the things, so usually in my own work, I am almost never dealing with things that are not data. But one of the things I think is really important to always remind, and we try to do this, but it's a challenge, is to remind people that whatever data set you're dealing with, that is just one framing of reality, right? And whatever it is that happens to be in that data set, it's probably not the entire story. It is hard, I'll say that, because people tend to think that because you have a visualization sometimes, it has to be true or it has to be perfect or that is a perfect framing of reality. And so I do think that that is something to be careful with and mindful and try to address. But as I was saying with things like the wind map, you can have text. It doesn't mean that people will read all the disclaimers and explanations.
So I want to add to that a bit, and that's language is a brute instrument too. And we're constantly interpreting what's happening in real time, and then we're reinterpreting it when we're retelling, and we tell different things to different audiences, and that changes our memory for events. So what reality is, what truth is, they're not tangible. So those issues are everywhere, not just in visualizations.
Well, one of the things I'm able to do with the major for undergraduates is to work with real data. And so one of the things I make sure that they understand is that, yes, I could make up some data for the exercises, and oftentimes I do when I'm explaining a particular concept, but for the most part, we have real world data that they work with, and so they get in a habit of actually working with real data as opposed to simulated data.
Yeah, and in fact, you mentioned that you're keeping these data sets fairly open, Fernanda, and that's your accessibility to that data is partially because a number of people in this field want to keep those sets open and available for everyone to use. And so that helps keep that flow going, yeah. I'm disqualified from the question because I actually write fiction. I'm a professional liar. So.
I worry a great deal about the data we don't collect, because that can, I mean, we're always getting an incomplete. Fernanda said that we're measuring the wind at, 12 meters, which isn't very high, and we're not measuring it here, and so forth. So there's lots of data we're not collecting, and that, I think, feeds into the biases that we have. There was all this brouhaha on facial recognition, and you gotta have the data before you can do the data mining, and there's lots of data we're not collecting, and what we do collect, it's like what we perceive. There's lots we're not hearing, we're not seeing, we're not touching, so there are data we're missing.
Well, actually, to that subject, I've been speaking a lot with people working on neural networks, machine learning and whatnot. And is it not on? Yeah. Oh, it seemed to go off. Sorry. They turn it on and off. Ah, I see. I have to show patience. And it is very often, it's 80 to 90% of the struggle is in the collection of the data and making sure that the data is relevant. And yeah, we always have to be cognizant of what data is not being collected. And that's certainly the elephant in the room in a lot of ways.
one of the problems I run into when I talk about storytelling with data is that the word story is always immediately conflated with something like narrative discourse. And what I heard across all of your presentations is something more about the importance of story is actually what's happening in the audience's mind. What's the easiest way to bring somebody who's kind of new to the concept of storytelling with data to that understanding that actually what the focus is how you're informing the story running inside somebody's head, not necessarily just the input?
I think one way to do that is to have the person visualize their own data. So you're telling your own story, and what does that look like, and how might you present it in such a way that you are ensuring that they're getting the insight that you're hoping that they get from that process. And so if you're visualizing your own data, you're vested in how that data is represented. So that's one way that I try to engage students, is I have them to think about problems that are dear to them or things that they feel strongly about. What type of data can they acquire that will help them to actually address whatever question or issue that they're interested in? And so that helps them to tell the story that they want to tell.
Actually, the canonical example of this may be, I think it was one of Amanda Cox's or Sean Carter. We have some New York Times people, they can correct me on this one, but the unemployment rate for people like you was a classic example of an opportunity to be the protagonist of the data, to select those stats that were relevant to you personally, which for my own weird concept of story it's very consistent with that notion of desire, because of course your desires are known best to you personally.
So we did a study a number of years ago where we went to the dorms and asked students, what are the stories that you tell at 5 o'clock when you're coming home and unwinding from the day? And we asked people to remember the stories that they had told and who they told them to, and whether they exaggerated something, omitted something, and so forth. And we found effects of all of those things. Almost everybody said, yes, I omitted certain things, I exaggerated certain things. Was I lying? Was I misrepresenting? No. This is the way stories are told. But we also found something that I think speaks directly to your point. What they told their roommates was very different from what they told their parents. Same story. And so we know we do adapt our stories to our audiences. We adapt them to their expertise, their knowledge, their background. Newspaper stories can't quite do that, but they know their readership. So I think there is an awareness of an audience. You can be wrong, like anything, but I think people and journalists and designers have an awareness of their audience, right?
Hello?
Yeah.
There. Yeah, I think a segue on that point exactly is how do you relate to your audience, and calling that out for students I think can be a very powerful thing. So one of my favorite stories that starts out as a bummer and then gets better is about a decade ago I had a conversation with one of the editors of the New York Times graphics department. And he admitted to me that New York Times readers had a ton of trouble understanding scatter plots. And he's like, people don't understand scatter plots. And that was such a bummer moment for me, because I was like, if people can't understand scatter plots, that's it, we're doomed. Like, well, why are we creating all these visualizations, like a scatter plot, right? So they're like, we don't do scatter plots anymore. I'm like, okay, what are we gonna do? Then a few years later, I started seeing scatter plots on the New York Times, and I was like, wait a second, what about the conversation I had? They have scatter plots. But what they were doing, which I think is a really wonderful way to start bridging the gap, is they would have the scatter plots, but then they would have the quadrants of a scatter plot clearly labeled, and they would say, if you're here, this is what it means. If you're over here, this is what it means, right? And to me, that starts to build that bridge between the really complex, like high dimensional, it's not even high dimensional, a scatter plot, but like, how do you bridge that gap so that your audience, as you said, can start to tell the stories they need to tell, or the stories they can find on the data. But I think it's the same data, it's even the same visualization, but you are extending a hand, you're holding their hand a little bit and saying, this is how you walk this path.
I want to add one more thing here. We're talking about data visualization, and I want to broaden it to information that we're visualizing or using visual ways of explaining information, because if you look through the museum, it's information. And SciViz is information, and I think that's been implicit. Some of us are doing data, some of us are doing information, but I just wanted to make that explicit.
Hello? Okay. So I was kind of curious, like, between the difference between storytelling and explaining. So for example, for storytelling, it's sometimes good to follow a certain structure for a story, because sometimes stories might go a bit too long without the climax, without the punchline. So that, like, the human kind of brain expects a certain pacing with stories. That might be tricky when you, for example, work with real data, because you're not really sure if you're like looking at the right snapshot. So I was kind of curious, like, are there any other techniques to kind of supplement the slow parts of a story, or do you kind of like just time the right data with the right story?
So the way I think about, that's an interesting question. I never thought about slow moments in a story, but I think the way I think about data visualization is the slow moments for me are the moments when I'm like, ooh, I'm not seeing much here. This is a mess. I'm still trying to make sense of this. And then the high moments are moments when I'm like, oh, maybe there's a pattern here, or maybe this is what it means. This is broadly what's happening with the data here. And I think if you can, from a storytelling perspective, I think if you can if you can highlight those moments somehow, or if you can bridge them with your audience, I think it's really important. Another thing I do when I present a visualization is I will introduce people slowly to the technique. Sometimes it's a brand new technique. They've never seen anything like this. They don't even know the image they are looking at. So I will say, okay, this is what this line means. This just decoding the visualization, slowly introducing them. And then when you start to see the patterns, that's when you can really get your audience and be like, okay, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then, oh my gosh, look at this crazy thing here, right? So, yeah, slowly building.
So I think another part of that is knowing who your audience is, because your audience will dictate the level of detail that you will, provide the visualizations for. So if you're creating visualizations for someone that's in your field, then of course it will be more of telling a story. But if you're creating visualizations for someone outside of your field, then part of that might be explaining what exactly that you're covering. And so knowing who your audience is also important.
Yeah, actually in the last couple of questions we've been orbiting something that might be summed up as where lies the restlessness? With the mention of scatter plots, with the sense of a disconnect that in some way a set of information may not apply to me. And I come back to your concept of partonomy, which is a word that I absolutely love, is in part that sense of a hierarchy of information that's organized in a way. A scatter plot may at times strike a viewer as, to use your analogy, as a number of body parts strewn out on the pavement without any kind of hierarchical combination. And a beauty of the partonomy idea is the fact that in the world of thought, we have tremendous speed in the way that we can navigate up and down that hierarchy, that you can ask somebody what they did in the last 5 years and then ask them what they did in the last 5 minutes, and they very quickly can navigate those. People have to feel, when they're confronted with information, that there's some kind of inherent order, and that they can group the all of it under one umbrella, and that they can group this portion of it under another. And that's what I think maybe they were struggling with at the times, and that may be what we're struggling with a lot of visualization is the old, again, coming back to Amanda Cox, the old, here's some data, hope you can find something useful in it. You know, it's just that doesn't seem to work so well. There has to be some kind of hierarchical organization.
So I was just going to mention, I think this conversation is so good, I don't want to stop. So do people, I know, yeah, oh, I'm getting a moment. Do you want to shorten your break by 5 minutes so that you can continuing this? You can give me a raise your hand. Yeah, okay, so we're going to go 7 more minutes with this unless the speakers are like, please let me have some bagels. And okay, so we have about 7 more minutes for this. I mean, I'm finding it utterly fascinating. I was sitting there thinking, man, I can't believe I made this happen. This is awesome. Yeah, you guys are amazing. Okay, so 7 more minutes, so that means we'll kind of gauge the number of questions. I think Eric has been waiting with Ari for a few minutes, and then there's some other hands. I'll just stand back and listen, but 7 minutes, and then we'll have a short break. Okay, thanks.
Check? Yeah, there you go. It's not exactly a storytelling question, so sorry, but I think it's really good for this group of panelists in particular. I'm curious to hear your take on the sort of the source of the data. Often we talk about data as it's the truth, and we visualize it as the story is latent in the data, but we don't talk about where it comes from, the potential fallacies or biases inherent in the collection of the data. Especially the educators in the room, I would love to hear from you, but from all of you especially. Thank you.
So one of the things that I do in the class is to introduce data visualization as a process. So students who take the class, they know absolutely nothing about data viz. If you ask them, they know everything. So we start out with the assumption that they know nothing, and one of the first stages of visualizing data is actually acquiring data. And so we spend a lot of time on thinking and talking about what data is, what are scholarly sources for which to achieve or acquire data from. And we talk about, just because it's available on the internet somewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a place that you want to actually, use that data for scholarly works. And so, like I said, I spend a lot of time the first weeks of class talking about what data is, how it can be represented in different ways. We talk about primary data sources versus secondary data sources. What does that mean? And so we really do try to create a foundational platform for them, because data visualization is about the data. And we've all heard garbage in, garbage out. And so I want to make sure that they understand basically the things that you've mentioned, is that there's an importance in making sure that what you're starting out with is quality data, so that you can address those questions or look at those different issues and look at different patterns that exist in the data and feel confident in the visualizations that they create.
I think that it's a crucial question right now in 2019, because of course we've reached a kind of crisis of insatiability as to where the bottom lies. I think of that phase that most kids go through when they're about 3 or 4, where they ask, well, why does this happen? And you say, well, because A, B, and C, and you think that'll settle the matter, and then they keep asking why and keep asking why and keep asking why. And there was a time when there were really a fair supply of conversation-ending places where you say, oh, well, that if the source was the National Science Foundation, or if the source was a respected newspaper or a respected expert in a field, or the Congressional Budget Office or whatever, that was, okay, we're done now. We've tracked it to a reputable source and we can move on with our lives. But unfortunately, now it's bottom. There is no bottom. People will keep asking why, like the 3-year-old, and what they're really asking is, well, whose team are they playing for, this information that you have? And that's why I think probably when the fever passes, we'll be glad if we've kept healthy the process of maintaining open, searchable, and very granular collections of data, because I think sanity will, oh God, I'm gonna regret saying this, I'm hoping the fever will pass, and I hope we will continue to collect and to have those. I don't want to go down that road. Somebody else take the mic.
If I can add, so I had a conversation with someone last night, and I pointed out that one of the things that we do in the class is we visit the library. Imagine that. You know, I'll ask students, who in this class has been to the library? And I get weird looks, like I have 3 heads or something. And so as a part of this process, we either take a trip to the library and we talk with librarians there, or I will ask the librarian to come to class. And so we really do spend a lot of time on data curation and data management, the data life cycle. And so it's an eye-opening experience for students because they hadn't thought about data in this way. And so it helps them when they're thinking about how they're going to visualize the data, but not only that, where they're going to get the data from. So the library is a valuable resource that I try to utilize in the class as well.
So I think we have time for one more question, which I see Zan's hand up, and then we're going to take a break and come back for more conversation on storytelling. So don't worry, there's still more, but last question, and then we'll take a 10-minute break.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed yesterday. Somebody asked a question that was like if there was like one thing question. So obviously places like the Exploratorium and science museums are amazing, but if there's one thing where you're like, oh, if only the museum would do X, what is that X for each of you?
You know, I have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. I don't have a favorite. and you know, 20, 30 graduate students, so I can't do that. Sorry. When you're 4, like Scott, you can say what's your favorite color. Not anymore.
What would you want the museum to do that they're not doing?
I'm going to defer.
So one of the things, hey Zan, one of the things that I would love the museum to do, but maybe you already have this, is some of the You Are Here pieces, because I think it's so much better to really, and Scott, I think you were talking exactly about that. If there's a way to bridge between like, this is the world, and this is you inside this world, the more you can do this, the more relatable really it is. One of the things that the New York Times, I know we keep talking about the New York Times, but that they did, and to this day, it is the most successful story they've ever had in terms of shares, is, I don't know if you remember this, is how people speak, how people talk. It became a visualization, right? It's like, do you say soda or pop? Do you say blah, 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 or blah, blah, blah? And then they would create this map of you in relationship to the rest of the US. It is by far the most shared New York Times story ever. So anything you can do where you put the little person in that picture, I think it speaks volumes.
When I was a child, when I was in my in 4th and 5th grade, I was obsessed with microbiology, and I do think making very small things very, very large, I can never get enough of it. I could never get enough of it as a kid. I cannot get enough of it as an adult. And we have so many new forms of display technology. I would love to see that expanded somewhat. I also think that VR is finally more than a novelty. I think we're heading into a very interesting period for that. VR escape rooms, I'm convinced that's going to be a huge thing. Can you imagine? Once it's a social thing. And my favorite color is teal.
I'm going to add.
Well, I found everything here to be engaging and on some scales enlightening, so I don't have anything that I can add to what's already being done right now. I think you guys have done a phenomenal job.
Bravo.
So I did think of something. I didn't hear your question. I don't hear or see. I'm going to be left with only smell, which is not my favorite. So, and I'm going to be the opposite of Fernanda. I want maps, local maps, not maps of where things are, but how things relate. So there are subsections of the Exploratorium that are devoted to particular topics, and I don't know how each of those exhibits relate. And if there were a sort of network map in front of those that told me, by going through these 6, 7 displays, I'm going to learn X, Y, and Z about hearing or about smelling or about cow's eyes or whatever, that would help me. And that kind of, because as you know, the Exploratorium is filled with things. You're distracted, you want to go here, you want to go there, you want to, and how do they interrelate? So a kind of department map would help me locally. And again, it could be a simple kind of network that would connect the things, the different exhibits, and how they're related. Yeah.
I heard you said that yesterday at lunch, and I thought that was a great suggestion and gets away from some challenges of visualizing large data sets. But okay, it's 10:53. I want to give a huge round of applause to our speakers.